That's one of them. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome to our second year of navigating publication discussion. Today, we are talking about aspects of publishing your research as a journal article. But before we start, I also want to let you know that we'll have 2 other sessions this semester. So mark your calendar if they are of interest to you. On October 15th, we're going to be talking about publishing everything that isn't an article in a journal. So that's book reviews, forums, special issues, things like that. And then on November 12th, we're doing a session called So You Think You Want to Edit a Journal. And we have a very interesting slate of journal editors. So if you're thinking that's something you want to do later in your career, if you're thinking, you're already mid-career and you're thinking about doing this soon, join us for that. I'm Krista Kennedy. I am an associate professor of writing and rhetoric at Syracuse. And we have with us Thomas Nakayama, who is co-editor of QED and also the past editor of the Journal of Intercultural and International Communication. He's the professor of communication studies at Northeastern. And we have Jenell Johnson, who is this year's Kniper Award winner for Best Article in RSQ. And she is associate professor of communication arts at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they have both published numerous articles in rhetorical studies and comm studies, and maybe a little bit in writing studies also for Jenell. Before we start, I want to make sure that we say thanks to the RSA Remote team. They're really the people who make things happen around here. That includes our digital communication officers, who are Eric Detweiler and Jeff Clegg, and also our outreach officer, Payne Petkoff, who's been working along with our executive director, Leslie Dinauer, to handle a lot of aspects of this session. And as always, Kathy Cisa, who makes a lot of gears turn for us. So thank you to all of these folks. The ways that these sessions work is we usually have somewhere around 20 or 30 minutes of panel discussion, and we have some questions that we've assigned ourselves. And then we also have 20 or 30 minutes of discussion for Q&A with you. So if you have a question for us as we go along, go ahead and drop it into the Q&A queue there. Don't put it in the chat, please. Put it in the queue, because it allows us to flag your questions, group them, and otherwise manage them and make sure that we get to as many of them as we possibly can. So we'll just start at the beginning here. How you have an idea for a journal article and you're thinking, okay, how do I move this forward? How do you take something that you are personally fascinated by and then make sure that it's of interest to the field? How do you eventually begin thinking about shaping this, fitting it into the, box size that is a journal article and putting it together? Jenell, do you want to start us off with that? Because you're often working with very interesting topics. They're also somewhat unusual topics.
Yeah, and I think that one of the big things, and first, thanks so much, Krista, for having us here. I think the biggest thing is to figure out who else might be interested in it. And I want to recommend 2 resources for this particular question. And one of them is David Zarefsky's essay, 4 Senses of Rhetorical History, which is about history, but also I think offers a really great kind of guide to thinking about how to shape something that is something that might be publishable in the field. And in large part, it has to do with figuring out what can someone else do with this, right? What might they find of value in it? How does it build on what's come before? And I think really importantly, how does it push the field where it needs to go? And so I think being able to articulate that, Zarefsky says anybody can study anything, right? And that sense of being personally fascinated is what draws us to the research that we want to do. But that second part of figuring out why should this interest other people is the key thing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Tom, is there anything you want to add to that?
I would agree. I would say that in writing your article, it's really important that you help the readers of the article understand what's at stake in whatever it is that you're doing. It's not so much the topic that you choose, but what you're telling them is at stake here in your interpretation or reading of whatever. And so that can help reach out to other people and make it seem more compelling, I think, for the readers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jenell, could you restate the article you mentioned?
So
in the chat?
It's actually a book chapter by David Zarefsky that's in, I think, the Rethinking Rhetorical History book by, I think it's Turner's book, but 4 Senses of Rhetorical History. And then the other resource that I'd recommend is Wendy Belcher has this book. It's called, I think it's like Publish Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks, which is a pretty generic title for a book, but it's a really, really useful resource. And it also helps you, especially if you've got something like a seminar paper and you're looking to turn it into a journal article, helps you walk through some of those initial steps of the process as well. And I'll type that one in the chat.
Okay. So you shaped this, you're thinking about, how it's going to be of interest and use to others. How do you then start to think about what journal you're going to submit it to? How do you think about assessing fit, and what kind of a research should a prospective author do? Tom, do you want to take that one, since you've been doing some of this editorial work over the past number of years?
There's a couple of different ways to take a look to assess a journal. And the first is to go to the web page for the journal. Some journals are sponsored by different organizations. Well, they're usually sponsored by some organization. And so it'll be on that web page, whether it's the National Communication Association or Michigan State University Press or whoever. And they have a page there. And when you look at just read the description of the journal, the mission and the vision. And sometimes editors, the current editor will post their own editorial statement that can be helpful. The second thing I think is helpful to do is to take a look at some of the recent issues in that journal and look at the kinds of stuff that they're doing, the kinds of things they're discussing, and see if your piece is a good fit for that journal. One of the things you want to think about, and as an editor, I think we all think about who is the readership for this journal and what kinds of articles are they going to want to read or be interested in. And so the readership, you're trying to assess the readership and figure out how your piece fits with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, people don't always know that RSA keeps a list of journals in rhetorical studies. So I just dropped a link to that into the chat as well. Jenell, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or should we forge ahead?
I think that was really great. The other thing I might say is to take a look at whatever it is that you've written, if you've written the piece already, and to take a look at your own bibliography to see where your sources are coming from. So if you find yourself regularly citing from a particular journal, it's very possible that you might already be in conversation. That might give you some sense of the fit. And also that idea that Tom raised about looking at the recent journals look different under different editors. And so, what a journal looks like, obviously the aims and scope are going to be similar, but that also kind of might give you a feel for the kinds of work that is tending to come out at a particular time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also, gives you a sense of really what our next question deals with is, that Burkean notion of the parlor, of entering a conversation that's already ongoing. And, what dimensions of that conversation should an author make sure that they're aware of? How can you best assess the sorts of contributions that you're actually making, in an article that you want to submit?
Do you want to start? You want me to start?
Go ahead and start us off.
Well, one of the things that I think some early authors make a mistake is that they have a very narrow sense of what all the conversations are that are going on, and they do a quick search on whatever it is that their paper is about. But there are other conversations that are related, and I think it's really important to understand what these other conversations are that are going on. And reviewers will often help you by telling you that you really, right now, a lot of people are discussing this topic or whatever, and this, would be helpful to engage in that conversation. And so there are a lot of conversations that are going on, and your project needs to or should connect to those conversations and extend the conversation in some particular way. Whether it's intersectionality or some of the other conversations that are going on, if it's relevant, obviously. And reviewers will help you do that, but try and figure out what the conversations are that are going on by looking, obviously staying up with the journals and of course talking to other scholars about what the conversations are so that you can engage in those conversations. Too many beginning authors, I think that they can start a conversation but there's already conversations going on before, and So engage in those and cite them and point to them and show where you're entering into the conversation.
Mm. And I think that's something that's really important. So it's easy to think early on that the way that you contribute to the field is by doing something entirely new that nobody has seen before, which is very hard to do. And really, I think what all of us are looking for is work that moves the project forward, right? That shows us new dimensions and new ways of thinking about, or just additional ways of thinking about something we've been thinking about for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And I think too, when we're thinking about that, the parlor metaphor, right? And thinking about this as a conversation, like there's two ways to think about it. So one of them is like what's come before and what's been going on, but also who hasn't been a part of that conversation and who should have been or who needs to be. And so, there's that sense of also being able to open up to different kinds of perspectives that, should have been there. And so one of the things to think about too is that the conversations, it's kind of a balance, right? Because the idea of intersectionality, right? Or, I'm teaching a class in archival research right now. And so, thinking a lot about the relationship with things like archive studies. That there are conversations that are not just in rhetorical studies that are outside of that field that are also very pertinent to bring in. It's just because rhetoricians are turning our attention to something doesn't mean, for example, that archivists, for example, have not been talking about something for years. By the same token, however, it's really key if you're publishing in a journal that's for our field that you are directly engaging in the field's take on it. And so one journal I'm really involved with is the Rhetoric of Health and Medicine. And there, one of the things that frequently comes up is that, people are citing literature from health humanities, which is fantastic, but that there is this conversation that is kind of a niche conversation within the subfield that is completely by the wayside. And so in as much as a journal is trying to kind of develop a subfield in some cases and really kind of develop that conversation, it's crucial to hold that balance between those two perspectives, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And I think that also is related to a question that just came in the queue. Woody Evans was asking, what do you do when there are aspects of your topic that have been really explored in depth in other disciplines, but not necessarily in rhetorical studies? And how do you jump into that in a responsible way?
I guess I'd say that rhetorical's perspective is always going to be different. Yeah. It's going to be unique, right?
You're constantly balancing, medicine and science and rhetoric all at the same time.
Oh, yeah. So my first book, for example, there was an incredibly definitive history. So my first book was a rhetorical history of lobotomy. And there was this definitive classic book on this in medical history. And so I think that there's, just because someone had written a history of this before, it didn't mean that they were going to take the same perspective that I was. And that this is where, your training as a rhetorician, it leads you to ask distinctive kinds of questions. We look at material in a different way than other people do. And so I think that that's it, that idea of like, someone's already done this in geography. Chances are they probably haven't done exactly what it is that you're thinking of. Usually it's just that subject matter overlap. But, people can write about, atoms from a number of different disciplinary perspectives. Just because someone writes about atoms doesn't mean that, other people can't.
Mm.
I think that gets to the question of interdisciplinarity and working with material from other disciplines. I think it's really a question of what can they add to the conversation that's going on in rhetorical studies in this case. And so some of the stuff can be very insightful and helpful in bringing in and adding to the conversation that's going on, but some of it, doesn't seem so relevant. And I think that's part of your job is to navigate moving between those. People who do interdisciplinary work need to be sure that they're navigating and thinking through the audience for their project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's been something I've had to think about a lot lately in writing about hearing aids. And that, there's been extensive work on rhetorical aspects of disability and disability rhetorics in the field, but not so much. And there's a lot of work on rhetoric and technology, but not a ton on how those things just go very closely together. So trying to find that balance between what's been done and then the very different literature in cyborg rhetorics and, hearing history and deaf studies has been an interesting thing to negotiate, but it can be done. And I found that editors and reviewers are really generous with their feedback about how to do it also. Is there anything else we want to say about interdisciplinarity, which is always tricky, but it's just especially tricky as an early career person, figuring out where to publish, figuring out how your department and your university value interdisciplinarity also. I mean, I would say that if you have a research mentor in your department, this is one of those things you really want to sit down, buy them a cup of coffee and ask them about. But if they say, yeah, this is great, we really value interdisciplinarity before tenure, then is there anything else that we want to say about negotiating that, especially about finding venues?
I'd look where other rhetoricians have published before. And that's not a guarantee, but that it's one hint that they might be open to a rhetorical perspective. And so I'll put a caveat on that. And that is if you're working in a small field. So, I work in rhetoric of science, rhetoric of health medicine, those kinds of fields, is that drop a line to the person who published in that journal and ask what their experience was. So, it might have been wonderful and good. It might have been a situation where the review process took over a year and the reviewers were not great, and so I think that's something where using some of the experience that the people have had who've already done that, but that would be the big one. And I think that there are some journals that are, so in disability studies, for example, there's a lot of overlap between rhetorical studies and disability studies. If you're looking to publish for an audience, say, of neuroscientists, for example, you're going to need to do a little bit more explaining about what a rhetorical perspective is and what it brings. And so the last thing I'd say is that if you want to do that kind of work, really, really helpful is to look at articles outside of the field and how they've explained this field. And so that is one of the most difficult things to do, and to do it concisely and such so that an outside reader might understand it. But take a look at examples of that as you're preparing something for an external journal like that, because I think that it's really tough to do that in like a paragraph or 3 paragraphs, but there are some really good examples out there of people who've done that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tom, is there anything you want to add?
Well, I guess every department and university is different in terms of how they treat some of these things. And so it's important for you to assess sort of, because the audience, when you have your publications, that's, if you're going up for tenure, that's your audience in a way. And I guess the main thing I would say is, don't only publish outside the field. Be sure you're publishing in the field, because don't make that mistake. But it's okay to do, well, at my university it would be fine to, do both. I don't know. But every university, I think you need to find out and talk to some senior scholars in your department and get a sense of if that's a mistake and you should only be publishing in these journals or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice. Let's move into some of the nitty gritty about so you've written your article, you've gotten it ready to go out, you're pretty solid with what you want to do here, or you have a manuscript in hand. So at what point and how should one approach a journal editor with an idea or with a manuscript? Tom, do you want to start us with that?
I've had people query me with their ideas about X or Y, and it's really hard as a journal editor. It's hard to assess without actually seeing the manuscript or seeing, what's the idea is fine. Often I don't know what else to say other than that idea would be fine and it fits with what the journal would be interested in. And then hopefully when they submit the manuscript, they're doing it in a way that would be of interest to the readership. But it's really hard to assess. I mean, I guess it's okay to contact the editor, but I don't really have a helpful answer other than, unless it's completely out of the ballpark, something you're working on that has nothing to do with the mission of the journal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I will say for most of my career, I've submitted completed manuscripts and just, gone from there with a cover letter, synopsizing what it is that I think I'm up to here. And, it's changed more recently as people have asked me to do things, or as I, have friends who are editing, which will happen once you hit mid-career. But I think the more you can show people a final product, the better equipped anyone is to assess what's going to happen. Is there any other thing you want to add to that, Jenell?
I'm like you. I've only ever submitted final final products there, but I think, the reason why I haven't done that in part, I think, is because I have been wary of writing an article for a particular journal and getting wedded to that idea, and so, I'm going to write a so-and-so journal kind of article, and then having it so tailored to that journal that it would be very difficult to turn it around, or it would take a lot of effort in that particular way. And I think sometimes too, I would be wary if you query a journal editor and say, like, do you think this would be a good fit, in getting kind of a false sense of security that, this is something where, like, it's possible that might be true, but you also, it might not be a good fit when you send it in, right? So I think that that's something to keep in mind with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've submitted your article, it's been through the review process, your editor has gotten a couple of reviews back, and let's say you've gotten a revise and resubmit. Let's kind of work through the possible things you could get. You could get it accepted with no revisions, and that would be fantastic. That's
very rare.
So let's say that you've gotten a revise and resubmit. And I think there's a range of reactions that people have to that sort of a response. So how should you understand an R&R? When you get one of these, what should you do with it? Jenell, do you want to start?
Sure. So when I started having friends edit journals, when I got old enough, when people I knew started becoming editors, one of the things that was shocking to me, and I heard this from a number of them, is how many people get an R&R and then never turn them around. And that was really, really surprising to me, in part because I think that I see an R&R as an invitation, and so, it's not an accept, it's not the same thing, but that is, for me, that's always the first barrier. Yeah, like this sort of accept with no revisions, or even accept with minor revision, is a unicorn. Like, it rarely happens to anybody, right? And I think that sometimes if you don't know that distinction and you're not familiar with it, I mean, when I first started publishing, I had no idea what some of those categories were, right? So, anything less than an accept, people think about as a reject, right? Especially because, people tend to be, used to a lot of success, right? If you're a graduate student, and I think that that's it, is reconceptualizing the R&R as itself the success, right? This is the invitation to continue on this project. And it's an invitation to be in conversation with these reviewers, right? Which is, I think, really huge, is that, if you're sending to a major journal in your field, that's getting sent out to some of the people who are experts in this thing, and they're going to help you with this, right? With the kind of feedback that they give you. So that would be the biggest one, is thinking about that. The accept with what, minor revisions or no revisions is something that, like, almost never happens. And so if that's your standard for what success is, you want to take it down a little bit.
You're going to be very sad a lot of the time.
Yes.
I think that's really important. I mean, an R&R means that people who are experts in this area are taking you seriously, and they want to talk to you about this work. And so maybe this is also a good time to talk about, how do you conceptualize reviewers? When you get reviews, which, often don't pull punches. They may not necessarily be mean, but they're going to tell you about yourself and tell you about your work. How might you, construct reviewers when you're reading these? And when and how do you respond to reviewers? So Tom, you've seen a lot of these. How do we think about this?
Well, I should probably not say all reviewers, but almost all reviewers, I really do think that they're taking your writing seriously and I think they want to help you, and they're trying to make suggestions that will improve the manuscript, make it more understandable to other readers, not just themselves. And so I think that you should take their comments as helpful. Now, sometimes the comments might not help strengthen the manuscript, and they may be misreading what you wrote, and that's okay. And so one of the things that I suggest is that after you have undertaken the revisions that you're going to do, you can write a letter anonymously back to the reviewers. Obviously, you don't know who they are, but and just say, thank you for your insightful comments. I made these changes. I think it's a much better manuscript, and you can lay out sort of the changes that you made. And then if there are changes that you didn't make, it's okay to say to them, I know that you wanted there were some suggestions that you do this, but here's why I didn't, and why I think that might weaken the argument here. And so you can have that conversation aside from what's in the revised manuscript to the reviewers. Mm-hmm. And I really suggest doing that, especially depending on how big an R&R is. As a journal editor, I try and signal to the author that this is a significant revise and resubmit, or this is a more minor revise and resubmit. And those are different things. I mean, a more significant one, they really want you to overhaul quite a bit of it. And depending on what it is, sometimes if they want you to reorganize your argument, those are pretty big revisions. And so I try and let the author know that this is a significant revision, not just a minor revision. Mm-hmm. So R&R, there are different kinds of R&Rs. And as you read the reviews, I think it's important, one, to keep in mind that I do think that they have the best intentions in trying to help you strengthen your manuscript. And number two, look through sort of and think about what is going to make this a much better manuscript, because sometimes the reviewers have helped me in my own journal articles. I thought, wow, I didn't think of that. That's a really great idea. And so I know you feel like you're under attack sometimes, but that's really, try not to read it in that kind of way. The spirit of the reviewers is really to try and help make this a much better article.
Mm-hmm. It really does. I had a question there and it's just kind of flown away. So I'm going to be quiet. Jenell, did you have something you wanted to jump in with?
Yeah. So I want to say this with a caveat that everything I'm about to say is easier to say than it is to do. This is very ideal, but I feel like my experience with publishing changed dramatically when I started rethinking my relationship with the reviewers that I was working with. And the very first thing I ever sent out for publication, it came back as an R&R. And in hindsight, it was actually a pretty friendly R&R. But at the time, I was like, oh, this is the worst thing of all time. And I think that it's in the years since then, I have really started to think about my reviewers as coaches. And like Tom was saying, that what they want is they want this article to be the best it can possibly be. And so that's where their commitment lies. Their commitment is not to me necessarily as a person. This is the spirit, at least, of anonymous peer review, but that's what they want. And so like, there's a sense in which if I see us on the same team, that really helps me to kind of, cushion some of those, like the comments that don't pull punches, we all get them and they're tough. But it's also that I feel like I have done my best work when I have been wrestling mentally, textually, conceptually with one or both of the reviewers. And that sort of process, it really does, at least in my experience, it has yielded better work. And, again, not all the suggestions end up in there. And, you got that space of explaining why or why not. But I think, honestly, the very, very few times I've had that experience of not having an R&R are the pieces that I have felt the most worried about, because they haven't been through that process of forging in conversation with other people as much. That was, I didn't trust it. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure this could be better than it is. And so that's, I think, a big thing. But again, this is a caveat, and also doesn't excuse, bad behavior, but that's, I think, a really helpful way to think about them as coaches. And like, sometimes your coaches can be grumpy, but ultimately, they want to see you finish the race.
Yeah. I think that's very important. And the same has been true for me. Once, part of it was also becoming a reviewer myself, and then going, oh, people, for the most part, really do want to help. I think what you're saying about that is really accurate. And then once it shifts things, even when you're unhappy about the question and it's requiring you to sit there for a week doing more reading and pondering angles for the whole thing, then it's helpful. It makes better work. I'm going to go back to something Tom said about, editors providing guidance about, what the main points of revision are, what minor points of revision are. I treasure editorial comments that prioritize things for me. And they don't always happen, right? Sometimes you just get, hey, here are 2 reviews. We're delighted for you to R&R this. So good luck, Is it appropriate then to write back to the editor after you've been through and you're really considering things and ask for guidance about prioritization or ask for clarification about some of the comments?
I think that would be fine. And in fact, if you want to sit down with the reviews and, give the editor your reading, it seems to me that these are the top 3 things that I need to prioritize. And that would be a very helpful conversation to have with the editor. I wouldn't just go back and say, what does this mean? I would lay out sort of, here's my reading. Is this your understanding? And then go from there.
Mm. It took me a long time to figure out that I could do that, by the way. We'll save other people some trouble here. And let me say also, we're moving into the Q&A portion of the program. So if you have questions, send them in the queue. Nothing is too basic. Let us know what it is you want to know. Let's talk about also the rare bird that is the provisional acceptance. We have a question here. It's like, what is the difference between a provisional acceptance and an R&R?
I don't know that, well, we don't have that specific thing, but I guess provisional acceptance, it sounds like this is when we accept an article, there are some changes that the reviewers made, but they're really minor, and the manuscript doesn't really need to go back to the reviewers. You just take a look, make sure that they made whatever the minor changes are. Mm-hmm. I guess that's what a provisional acceptance is. And it's fairly rare, but we've had a few of those where, we didn't feel the need to send it back to the reviewers. The revisions were pretty minor. Just take a look, make sure they did it. And mm-hmm. Whereas an R&R, to me, needs to go back to the reviewers.
Can I ask a question of Tom?
Yeah.
So this is a question that I hear a lot from graduate students. So if you have a sort of provisional R&R, you've got that, where should that go on your CV? So is that still work in progress, or is that something that you would think of as an accept?
When they make the revision and submit it back, it'll be accepted. I mean, we send an acceptance notice then. So I would say it's not accepted yet, but because they still need to do the minor revisions that need to be done.
So, I mean, I think that's a really important thing, at least, especially people on the job market, right? It's like those two things really matter. And so like waiting until you see that word accept on that email, even if things are almost there, right, is key.
I ethically, I think it would be fine to put provisional acceptance. I don't know, what do you think?
I've considered it okay to put down whatever the letter I've got from the editor says.
Whatever the phrasing that they have. Yeah.
The phrasing they have. And it's never okay to like round off.
Yes. I like that. Yeah.
But I do tell the author that, these are fairly minor revisions. And so once you make them, we won't be sending it back out to the reviewers. We'll just take a quick look at it, make sure you did, because they're really something minor.
Mm-hmm. And an R&R is not an acceptance. An R&R is you have work to do. It's going to come back. We're going to send it back to the reviewers, and then we'll see what happens. How do we think about rejections? Let's say you put your heart and soul into this. You've submitted it. It's been reviewed, and it comes back with comments. And I'm sorry, but this is just not for us right now. What do you do with that? I mean, you sit with it. You go have a drink. You process it. But then after you slept on it and you've recovered a little bit, what's your next action?
I would suggest taking a look at the reviews and seeing if there are things in there that are major flaws with your manuscript, with your argument or your use of these theories or whatever it is, that definitely need to be addressed before you send it out again. If it's just a bad fit for that journal, or if it's, then send it out again.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that balance between not sitting on it too long, right? And turning around and just saying, they don't know what they're talking about and sending it out right away is being able to do something like that. It might be helpful to find a friend or a trusted mentor to have them read those through and really kind of see and have a conversation about that. But one of the great piece of advice I got when I was a graduate student is that rejects and how you handle them in large part distinguishes people who publish a lot from people who don't. And that if you take that kind of rejection as the last stop at the line, then, then you got to start over from something. The metaphor I often use with my own graduate students is that if you've, the game Pachinko or Plinko on The Price is Right, where you put something up and it kind of like flutters down, is that in some ways, that's how I see it's that sending things out to journal is a process. So you send it out there and it plinks down to R&R, great. Well, and you're working on that. It hits reject, you retool it, and then maybe you send it somewhere else. But the idea is to keep things moving. Eventually, if you send it out a bunch of times, well, maybe then maybe it's something that can retire into your drawer or whatever the computer version of that is. But I think that idea of trying to like keep things moving to different journals, reframing it is key than starting from scratch with each new project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have a question in the queue that I'm wondering if we can speak to. What are the common mistakes that separate an R&R from a reject? And I think, in part, reviews are so specific to the submission itself that it may be hard to speak to that. But I'm wondering, especially Tom, are there super common mistakes that you see that either just lead to a desk rejection, or that you think that really flag rejection for reviewers?
Ooh. Wow, this is a difficult question to answer because there's just so many different reasons why dealing with, sometimes it's not a good fit for the journal. And that would get more of a desk reject. I don't do that many desk rejects because I think even the reviewer comments can be helpful for any author if they want to take those reviewer comments seriously and think through what they're suggesting. But there have been times I have because it just didn't fit with the journal, or I had someone submit a manuscript that it was double spaced, but it was only like 7 or 8 pages long. And it's like, so I try not to do it too often. Now, in terms of when the comments come back, if the project needs too much of an overhaul and it's not going to be able to, the revision is too big, then I might reject then. Because if it seems like it's not doable, or it's going to change the entire project, then it doesn't seem like that's something that we need to continue the conversation in the revision process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. Do we suggest putting together a cover letter for initial submissions? And if so, what should go in that sort of cover letter?
I rarely see those, to be honest, on the initial submission. On the revisions, yes. If you get an R&R, you need to be on it. You need to, and I think what Jenell said is absolutely right. There's too many people who get an R&R and then disappear. And I'm not sure, I think they're misreading it as a rejection, even though I'm pretty explicit in the cover letter that this is an invitation to revise and resubmit. But yes, if you do a revision, I really strongly recommend a cover letter. But with the initial submission, I don't know, maybe Krista, it works for you, but it does. I haven't seen one that has really helped that much, frame the project in a way that initially is all that helpful. But it might be helpful. Well, actually, it might be helpful in picking reviewers, but I don't know. It's so rare to get a cover letter.
I'm fascinated to hear that. Like, it's about to save me so much time because someone somewhere told me I had to do these, and so I've always done them. And so, wow, I always learn things at these sessions. Jenell, what were you going to say?
I wonder if this is kind of a holdover from the time before we had automated submission processes, when you were still like mailing 3 hard copies of this.
Yeah.
Which is a wonderful relic. But I wonder, because it's, I think that in large part the system gives you these options, right? But it's a lot of the stuff you would have said in a cover letter beforehand. I think the only way I can think of this is like if you win, for example, like an award, like if it's an award-winning essay, that might be an interesting thing. Like a little bit of the provenance might be an intriguing thing. But again, I can't imagine why that would necessarily sway the decision either way. It's not.
Okay. Another question. Is it okay to apply to multiple journals at the same time or just one at a time? Is it problematic if multiple journals are interested in your work?
Yes. Many journals explicitly say, that this is not, you have to make a statement that this is not under review at any other journal at the current time. Mm-hmm. And I think most journals follow that practice. I want to say all, but I try and shy away from using those universal words, but almost all journals do not want you submitting your manuscript to multiple journals at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I think that's just a blanket policy too.
Yep.
There are several questions here about timelines for reviews and the ways that COVID-19 has really impacted that. So I'm wondering if we can speak to the distinct challenges the ongoing COVID-19 crisis has presented for the journal review process. How has it affected workflow, and how can prospective authors navigate these issues, especially when you have graduation timeline and tenure timeline?
Well, I think the pandemic has impacted turnaround times on reviews and things like that. I mean, I'll be honest, and not in a good way. And so I think it's okay, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. It's okay to bug me and just query about the status of your manuscript. It's not going to make me angry or anything. And you can do it in a nice way. And I think it's, then I do go in the system, and I have bugged reviewers before saying, please, please, please. So I think it's okay to bug the editor.
I mean, I think typically when I get a review request, it asks for a response within 4 to 6 weeks. And sometimes people can hit that, sometimes they can't. So what do we think an acceptable amount of time is to wait for a response? And when, how long would you wait until you recommend following up on a submission?
I don't entirely know why, but in my experience, it's always kind of about 3, maybe 4 months. I don't know what it is with COVID right now, but if I haven't heard anything by sort of like 3-4 month mark, then I will query, and especially if it's a journal that is, like a major journal where you can expect that there's probably a lot more things that are going through. But, the other thing about querying is that I know from friends who have edited journals that it's sometimes the case that like the manuscript, it doesn't literally fall through the cracks, but I know that sometimes there's a situation where, it gets tagged. I don't know what the process is, but it hasn't actually been sent out to reviewers, or that there's a review that's somewhere stuck in the system that's no fault of anything, but the editor wouldn't have known about it. And so, that's a situation where, if you wait 9 months and it's sitting in there, that's not something, but it's rare, but apparently it does happen.
Yes. Let me say that it does happen. I mean, sometimes the review request goes out and the person accepts, but there's the manuscript doesn't get to them, and all kinds of things. And I'm not sure why there's these glitches, but it's okay. I would say after 3 or 4 months to inquire about the status of your manuscript. That's fine. I don't know why these glitches happen. Well, sometimes they upgrade the system to make it better, and so.
And things became slightly worse for a little while. Yeah. Last question related to this, at least it's in the queue right now, is about just the general timeline from submission to publication. Academic publishing moves rather slowly. And my experience has been, 1 to 2 years, really, depending on the venue, depending on whether it's print or online, depending on whether it's a major journal or a smaller journal. So what would you guys say about that? The question really is, how long is too long from submission to publication given the pandemic?
How long is too long?
I think that depends, I think, on a lot of factors. I mean, it depends also on where you are in your career, because, like there's too long when you are like a year away from the end of your tenure clock, right? It's, time starts moving in different kind of ways. And so I think that really, really depends. And it depends on the venue itself too. It's, sometimes things are surprisingly fast, sometimes they're slow, but it's really hard to say. a standard.
Let's see. Keep those questions coming in. You guys are asking wonderful questions. One more question about acceptance, and then we'll move on to questions about manuscript preparation. So do you expect the publications process, actually, sorry, the queue jumped. I jumped questions here. So Elizabeth Kimball has a question. For the journals that are really competitive, what's the chance that even a great article isn't going to make it in just due to lack of space? Or when you're talking about, higher level journals with smaller acceptance rates, of course, are all the articles truly eventually getting in there?
Ooh, that's a hard one to answer. The reason it's hard to answer is when journal editors shift over, they have the new editor coming in, they have very different attitudes about the previous manuscripts that are in process. Some want to clear the deck and start with a clean slate, and others want to take those manuscripts and continue processing them with those reviewers that are in the queue with that manuscript so that they don't have to start from scratch. I've seen both happen in editorship turnover. So in terms of I've seen some people get caught in the switch from one editor to another. So it's really hard to say how often that happens or whatever. But it's really based on the personality of the incoming editor or their philosophy about continuing the processing other manuscripts. And so sometimes editors have said, I'm filling up my last issue, and they just sometimes they'll let you know, or I'm finishing up my last issues. You may want to wait for the new editor. Sometimes they'll tell you that.
Yeah. And and there's also just the case that like a 5% acceptance rate means that 95% of the rest of the stuff is being rejected, which is not that uncommon. One more questions about reviews and reviewers. Can we reflect on when journals ask to have you suggest reviewers? I will say that I've had that happen more rarely, but it definitely does happen. What do you guys think about that?
Ooh, I've never asked authors to suggest a reviewer.
I don't think I've had that happen at a journal. For books, they will oftentimes do that.
Books, yes.
But I can imagine that it would be very similar with a journal. As you're thinking about potential people to review it, think about who do you most want to get feedback from with this. One of the things, when I was starting out that I did not know, and I had no idea that this was the case, and it's not always the case, Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that if, for example, there is a thinker from the field whose work you're drawing on a lot in that piece, very good chance that it might go to that person for review because they are going to be an expert in this particular thing. And that's something that I had never really considered before, but that might be something you can think of too. If you're asked to suggest reviewers, is who is the essay itself in conversation with? Who are you building on? Who you're drawing from?
Mm-hmm. Because it is highly likely that you're going to be in conversation with that person in a very real sense. On a different topic, question, how do I balance being anonymous but still including my critical self-portraiture? Can I share where I'm from, my race, gender, sexuality, etc., without affecting the blind review process?
I would say yes. Because I think that, I guess I've read so many manuscripts where people do reveal those things. I mean, they don't say their name. My name is, I would leave that out, but, indicating your gender or your racial identification or any of those things that you want to reveal that you think are relevant to the project, certainly. And sometimes when people more often people don't do that, and the reviewers say, it's really helpful if you would write yourself in here more so we know where you're coming from, and identify yourself as a male or female or whatever, and they ask for that. So I wouldn't leave it out. I mean, I would just make sure you leave your name out, but beyond that, I don't know that many people will necessarily figure out who you are, to be honest, or even would try to figure it out. They just read the manuscript.
And I would say also, I mean, if it's important to talk about your research stance in the course of an article, I mean, don't shy away from that. I mean, I find very often it's important to say that I'm a deaf woman doing research on deaf stuff in my articles. And honestly, I don't think it's ever been a problem. Jenell, is there anything you want to add before we move on to talking about manuscript preparation? No. Okay.
I totally agree with both of you. Yep.
There are a couple of kind of intertwined questions here about, knowing that it's very important to listen to conversations so that you can participate in the conversations, but then, oh my gosh, how do you keep from getting overwhelmed by all the conversation? And I think that's also really related to another question about how do you know how much is enough? How do you know when it's time to send that manuscript out? When have you done enough of centering yourself in the conversations and eventually and making your argument, and you just at some point you have to hit send? It's a hard thing to know,
It is.
Is there an individual line that each one of you just draws in the sand eventually? Deadlines will do it for you. Eventually, if you're working on a session, if you have some sort of external deadline, eventually you just got to hit go.
I'm not sure if this helps, but I have never personally felt like I was ready to hit send when I hit send. So, if that helps. So what happens is that you got to do it. I mean, it's sort of like jumping into the lake when it's cold, like it's not to say that, there's not stuff to be doing, but if you find yourself here, I'm going to be concrete about this. If you find yourself just kind of noodling on things and it's just like kind of tweaking this thing over here and it's like maybe I just need one more source, probably you're just kind of putting it off. And that's the point where you hit send. If what you're doing, if you find yourself that kind of constant revision place, that's where it's just probably the fear that's keeping you from doing it. And then you just hit send and then take yourself out for dinner.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Tom?
I would agree with that. I think one of the things that you should be thinking is that the reviewers will tell you what needs to be fixed in a way. And so you just sitting behind your computer, tweaking words and things like that. I mean, just hit send. And the reviewers will tell you what, wasn't clear, or because sometimes it's hard to see yourself. It seems really clear to you what you're talking about, but the reviewers, have a different take. And so it's really important to get those reviewer comments and and they'll tell you what to revise. And so I don't think you need to polish. It's like sitting there polishing your stone over and over and over. Just hit send.
There's not a platonic ideal of your essay that exists out there somewhere that you're trying to hit, like it's something that's going to change when you get those reviews back too, so it's like, there's not the way that this always was supposed to have been. And that includes when you're working with your reviewers, the essay is the essay that you write.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. I mean, there's never going to be a point where you're like, here's the perfect jewel that I have formed and I am so happy with it. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And something one of you just said reminded me of talking to a senior scholar when I was a graduate student. And he said, oh, I finally just decided it was time to let the reviewers worry about it. I'm done worrying about it. And that reconfigured my relationship to reviewers a little bit. But also, yeah, I mean, at some point, you just have to let someone else worry about it and they tell you what needs to happen because you are no longer a fit judge of your own work by the time you stared at it that long. So, yeah, at some point, it just goes out. Another question, can we talk a little bit about style? Some of us tend to have more playful styles, which can fit with some journals, but not with others. Can you give us some sense of handling or negotiating playfulness as scholarly writers? And I think there's a time, especially early in your career, at least there was for me, where you feel like you have to be very, very serious and scholarly and use all the big words. And I felt at least like I really had to conform in that way. It changed over time. And I don't know how that has functioned across the course of your publishing careers, but I'm very interested in what you had to say about that.
Well, I'm a little bit longer in the tooth than both of you, but when I started in the field, I felt much more constrained in how you can write. And I feel like over the last few decades, things have really opened up and that in the journals, you'll see lots more innovative ways of writing, and that it's not so much reporting information, at least on our side of the field, it's really performing the scholarship in the writing itself as well. And there's a lot of room there for playfulness. And I think reviewers are much more open to innovative ways of presenting your scholarship. It doesn't have to be in any particular format, but it does need to be clear and organized. Beyond that, I think there's plenty of room for that. It's not nearly as constrained as it used to be.
I think if you're clear and you have a well-structured argument, you can get away with a lot of playfulness. I don't know, what do you think, Jenell?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also something that, depending on the journal too, some journals are more, so I think with everything else, it's like, well, what journals that are more open to kind of more creative ways of doing things are good places to go. But yeah, that's something that also I agree with both of you. It's like, it's come with time. I think some of that kind of more playful, creative thing. I also want to put a plug in. Kara Finnegan has an email newsletter where she talks about scholarly writing as creative writing, and it's so good. And you should totally check it out. And if I don't know what the resource, someone can put it in the chat in here, but to sign up for it. But I think she sends things out every month, and it's been super useful.
Mm-hmm. I'll see if I can grab a link for that for you guys here in a minute. And our last question, because we're going to run out of time. What is your perspective on graduate students serving as reviewers? How does an early career scholar or a graduate student become a reviewer? And maybe related to that, how does one eventually become a board member? How does this happen?
I think you should I would be open. Feel free to contact the editor and say that you're happy to serve as a reviewer, and obviously say a little bit more than that about what kinds of things you can review and what you're most interested in. I mean, I have no problem with graduate students being reviewers. I don't have a philosophy about that in a negative way. How do you become a board member? Board members are invited to be on boards, and sometimes if we rely on somebody to do quite a few reviews, I mean, after several, it's like, okay, do you want to be on the board? Because obviously the kind of work that you're doing and the kind of reviewing that you're doing, it seems pretty central to if we keep asking you, then you must be central to what's going on in the journal. And so a board member is somebody, well, there's different types of boards. There's advisory boards and then editorial boards. I'm talking about the editorial board, which is the board that does the reviews. And if people are doing a lot of that kind of stuff, it's we often invite them to be on the board. As a reviewer, if a particular journal is bugging you a lot to review a lot of manuscripts, I think it's fair to also ask, can I be on the board? You keep asking me to review, and I think that would be a fair response.
So, do we have any last words? We have 3 minutes. Is there anything you feel that you want to add that we haven't covered?
I would just suggest, if you get an R&R, be on it. I mean, sit down with the reviews, lay out what you think the issues are as best you can. You feel free to run it back by the editor, but you don't have to, and you can just lay out and then get on what you think are the most important revisions, but definitely turn it around. It's an invitation to continue the conversation. Don't read it as a rejection. If you get a rejection, it will say, we're sorry to reject your manuscript. It will say. So if you get a revise and resubmit, please continue the conversation.
Absolutely. And if you get a rejection, don't just put it in a drawer. I mean, work with a mentor, figure out what you need to do to it, and send it back out the door. Keep the manuscript in play. You're going to feel better about it. You'll feel better about yourself. And that momentum will keep you moving on to your other work that you want to get out.
Yeah, everybody gets rejections. This is, I think the thing is that we don't talk about it enough. And so it's moving things through. Just keep it moving. Send your stuff in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for being here. I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and people are telling you in the chat that they do as well. So this has been a fantastic conversation. We all really appreciate it. And we're done here, but be sure to join us again on the 15th, where we'll be talking about all the other things that are not journal articles that you can publish in a journal. And take care of yourself in the meantime. We'll see you then.
Can't remember who it was that had asked the thing about pushing send. That's what I want to say. I should have been that. It's like that person, I can tell they're waiting. They're waiting. If you're still on the chat, send your article in, push send, do it. It's a Friday. It's a good time to do it.
It is. And I mean, we find that the afternoon is usually the sweet spot for people being able to come. So, all right. I think Eric is asking us in the chat if you could to close up shop. So yeah, thank you both. This was great.
Thank you.
I hope you have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you for being a part of this. See ya.
Thank you. So are you going to give us the YouTube link or?
Yeah, I'll send you the link. Let me drop it in the chat right now.
Oh, you already know what it is?
Well, I've got the channel saved in my, it's not to this page, but it's to the RSA channel.
Okay.
And so it'll take a little time for this file to get processed. And once I've got the initial edit done, I'll post it as an unlisted video and just send you all a link so you can take a quick look at it before I switch the setting over to public so that it's just generally viewable.
Thank you.
All right, great.
Yeah, and if you want to just take a look at what the other videos from past events look like, you can just use that link right there to get to the channel.
Thanks for all your work in putting those videos together. That I know that takes a lot of time.
Yeah, it's been fun. I'm running a little bit more behind than I would like, but they're getting up there and I'm working through them. So thanks for that, Jenell.
Yeah, Eric has done such a great job of thinking about how to make these accessible for a wide range of people, and I really appreciate that.
That's fantastic.
It's great.
Glad to do it. And yeah, thanks for your contributions today. All right, well, I'll wrap it up, but see you again soon, Krista and Tom and Jenell. Thanks again.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care of yourself. Bye.
Bye.